It's so good to see all of you here this morning. Welcome. Are you tired of COVID yet? Pretty much everybody I speak to is saying, I'm so tired, I'm up to here. I wish that we could go back to the way we were. Reminds me of that old, I think it was a Barbara Streisand song about memories of the way we were. There's actually an official term for it now. It's called COVID fatigue, and people are suffering from COVID fatigue. We're over the masks and the fear and the limits and the rules. And I mean, there's some people that are still so grumpy that they can't buy alcohol on the weekends. Hands up. Just checking. Come on, aren't you going to be honest? Oh, is that how you do it? You top up on Thursday, I see. Do you think life is ever going to get back to normal the way it was? Maybe not. What happens if it doesn't? Is that strange? Is it weird? Is it not God's will that we don't go back to the way it was? Because let's be honest, most of us don't like change. We don't like things being forced on us. Change makes us feel a little uncomfortable and insecure because we like to know what's going to happen tomorrow. Usually the last thing I do before I go to sleep or switch out the light and switch out my eyes is I think, all right, now what's coming up tomorrow? I'm going to do this then and that then. I've got this appointment. I'm going to do that then. You know how frustrated I get when all of a sudden in the middle of everything you get the phone call and, oh, no, you've got to do this, and what about that? And the Israelites felt exactly the same when they were in the desert. They were hauled out of slavery in Egypt and dragged through the desert and made to eat strange things that they weren't used to. And they eventually got to a place where they said to Moses, we actually want to go back to the way it was. We want to go back to Egypt. Even though we were slaves then and beaten and, made to, their job was to make bricks. Look what that says in Numbers chapter 11. We remember the fish we used to eat free in Egypt. We had all the cucumbers, melons, leeks, onions, and garlic we wanted. But now our appetites are gone. All we ever see is this manna. You're not the only one to get grumpy about, oh, things change. I want to go back to. But is it realistic to believe that our lives will continue the same without change? Is it realistic to believe that tomorrow will ever be predictable? What's Afrikaans for predictable? Voorspelbaar. That's a big word. Is it realistic to think that we can live a life without unpleasant surprises? If we're honest, no. It's unrealistic. We're crazy to think that we can live a life predictably without strange surprises. And actually God tells us in the Bible, we need to be prepared for change all the time. Here's a passage in Ecclesiastes, Prediker, if you're Afrikaans speaking. Ecclesiastes chapter 3, and pick it up from 1. For everything there is a season, a time for every activity under heaven, a time to be born and a time to die. We don't like thinking about that. A time to plant and a time to harvest. A time to kill. That killing they're talking about there is judicial, capital punishment. And so the Bible says there is a time to actually put someone to death for doing a serious crime, and there's a time to heal. There's a time to tear down and a time to build up. A time to cry and a time to laugh. A time to grieve and a time to dance. a time to scatter stones, and a time to gather stones. It's talking about a building. It's time to move the stones out the way. It's time to get them together to build. It's a time to embrace and a time to turn away. A time to search and a time to quit searching. A time to keep and a time to throw away. Are you a hoarder? Or are you married to somebody that if you leave it lying around longer than 2 days, it's gone? You didn't use that, so obviously you don't need it. I worked for a mine manager when I was on the mines once, and he said, if he sees a bakkie and you haven't used it for 2 weeks, he took the bakkie away from that department and went and parked it because obviously you didn't need it. There's a time, where was it? To keep and a time to throw away, a time to tear and a time to mend. I'll talk about that tearing and mending just now. A time to be quiet and a time to speak. We spend many years teaching our children there's a time to be quiet. A time to love, a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace. What do people really get for all their hard work? I've seen the burden God has placed on us all, yet God has made everything beautiful for its own time. And He's planted eternity in the human heart. But even so, people cannot see the whole scope of God's work from the beginning to the end. Folks, we have lives that are unpredictable. We don't know what tomorrow is going to hold. We don't know if we're going to hit a fourth wave. We don't know whether the lockdown level is going to be raised to, 2 sometime soon for the local government elections, which they think might be on the 1st of November, blah, 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 blah. But you know what? I think of a story of a senior business executive, and he had this little plaque on his desk which faced the people that came in and sat down. And that little plaque said, "This too shall pass." In other words, this won't last forever. And I think God's bottom line for us, and I'll explain a bit more around it now, is, this too will pass. We will get through this. I can remember, I was speaking actually to my brother yesterday. He's 7 years older than me, so he's really old. And he's planning on doing the Robben Island swim probably in the new year. I mean, he's 68 years old now, and he's planning on doing the Robben Island swim from Robben Island to, I think it's to Blouberg Strand, in the blooming cold Atlantic Ocean. I said, "Are you crazy?" No, he's always went, he likes doing these kind of extreme things. A couple of years ago, where he did Ironman, done in PE when they were still allowed to do it. But he was saying that he's been reading up about the Robben Island swim. He stays in Durban, so he's used to sea swimming in warm water. He said now he's going down to Cape Town next week. He's going to do a little bit of acclimatization to get used to the cold water. But he was reading about these Robben Island swims. And he said, when it's a 7-kilometer swim, I think it is. And he said, when most people pull out. He was speaking to a guy from the club that runs it down there who's done 30 of them. He said, most people pull out 1 kilometer from the end. They've done 6. They've just got 1K to go. And they pull out. When I used to run Comrades is about 80 odd kilometers. 60K mark. Isn't it so, Grant? The 60K mark is when most people pull out. Because you're cold in the seawater swim, and you're tired, and it just seems like there's too much left to go. Don't give up just before the end. This too will pass. I remember a guy that's mentored Grant, Colin, and myself as well. He said, when you feel like that at 60 Ks, say to yourself, just walk a bit, keep going. You will actually get through this and you will feel better again. You'll get your strength back. And if you're feeling like saying, hang in there. This too will pass. There's a time for everything, and this time will finish. If you know that you just have to hang in there for another 1 kilometer of swim in the cold Atlantic Ocean because Blowberg is just there. You can hang in there. And that's God's inspiration for us this morning. One thing that we need to remember, nothing stays unchanged forever. I see that when I look in the mirror. Nothing stays the same. I don't look like I used to on my ID photo. In fact, I've got a new one of these card IDs. I look a little bit more like that. But my old ID that I got when I was 18, I went to the bank once and hand your ID, and the lady looked at the ID and looked at you and said, you don't look like your ID at all anymore. I felt like saying to her, shut up. But no matter how hard we try, and ladies, how much money you spend on anti-aging cream, constant change is here to stay. And we think, oh, this is weird, things are changing. But actually, change is normal. Change is natural. And if we think we can micromanage our lives to make sure that they're predictable or even stable, we're fooling ourselves. We're deceived. Verse 2a, it says over there, there's a time to be born and a time to die. What is usually the last line in a fairy tale? And they all lived happily ever after. That is such a lie. Because happily ever after does not happily ever after does not last forever. Death doesn't always come for the oldest person before the youngest person. Sometimes parents bury their children. And you know what? We have absolutely no control over when we are born and when we die. And so, there is a time to be born and there is a time to die. You've got no control over it. Are you ready for it? Have you had that conversation with your loved one? It was something my late wife and I talked about every now and then. It's not a nice thing to talk about, but if you die first, what am I going to do? If I die first, what are you going to do? What happens? Have that conversation. Because it just makes it so much easier when the unpredictable, the unpleasant happens. Because let's be honest, if you're here and you're married, one of you is going to die first. Very few married couples die together at the same time. One of you is going to pass first. And do you know when that's going to be? I don't either. God says it's going to happen. Don't be surprised and say, oh, I never knew this was going to happen. No, you can't. Go back to what's today? The 12th of September 2021. Pete told you it's going to happen. God told you in Ecclesiastes chapter 3 verse 2, it's going to happen. Don't be surprised. Prepare yourself as best you can. That's activities you have no control over. Then it carries on in the rest of verse 2 and verse 3 to talk about activities we do have control over. It says there, a time to plant and a time to harvest. A time to kill and a time to heal. A time to tear down and to build up. We can control when we plant things. We can control disciplining of those around us. We can control what we build and what we break down. And the point that I believe God wants us to get over there, the things we can control, remember what worked for us in the past is not necessarily going to be the best way of doing it today. The way I used to train 20 years ago as a runner doesn't work for me now because I'm 61 and my body just can't do what it used to do 20 years ago or 2 years ago. If the horse you've been riding has died maybe it's time to get off. Think of that. If the horse that you've been riding on has died, maybe it's time to get off. The way you discipline your children when they are 4 is not necessarily the way that you need to discipline them when they are 11 or 17. The way you deal with things then is not necessarily the way you need to deal with them now. I mean, I love gardening. How many of you have heard of pansies? Gesiggies, if you're in Afrikaans, or petunias. That's the same in English, it's petunias, in Afrikaans it's petunias. I don't get upset with my pansies and my petunias after 2 months when they stop flowering and they die. Because I know they're annuals, eenjariges. And there's a season for them to flower, and then I must pull them out and put new things in. But how many of us, in the way we do things, the way we expect things to happen, expect that I should be able to expect to be able to run a standard marathon in under 4 hours. I used to be able to 10 years ago, but you know what? There's no ways I can do it now. I don't think I'll ever be able to do that again, because I picked up this hip thing and I had my knee done, and it's just the realities of life. In your life, what do you need to start altering? What expectations do you need to start changing? Because I've seen people get so frustrated because they can't do that anymore. You will never be able to do it anymore. It doesn't help you be frustrated. Just come to terms with it and say, there's a time for that. The time for that is now past. Now it's a time for something different. What do you need to alter? What do you need to renew in your life? What do you need to replace in your life? I'm coming to the stage when I'm having to think, I might have to replace my running with cycling. Sorry to all the cyclists, but I see that as a downgrade. But I need to be honest about that in my life. What do you need to consider changing that you have control over? That your horse is getting old and maybe sick, and maybe your horse has died. Sadly, I see that so often in many churches where we've always done it this way before. And we've always used this because Auntie so-and-so, whose plaque of remembrance is in the Garden of Remembrance, donated that to us 50 years ago. And how can we ever... It's not working, but we can't change it. You know, the theme of a dying church is, we've never done it like this before. I don't believe we need to change the Bible at all, but the methods in a church need to change. The music needs to keep up to date, because some of the old songs have died. It's time to get off. Verse 4 to 7, or 4 and 7 says, there's a time to cry and a time to laugh, a time to grieve and a time to dance, a time to tear and a time to mend, a time to be quiet and a time to speak. Loss and grief happen to us all. Up until 3 years ago, I used to say, I haven't ever actually lost anybody close to me. And so I don't really know how it feels, but I can imagine. In the last 3 years, my wife, my dad, and my mom have passed away, and my one son-in-law's dad from COVID back in December. And so I've experienced that. It's going to happen to all of us sometime. When it says there, a time to tear and a time to mend, that sounds a bit strange. But there was a Jewish tradition, and I think still is, that if somebody dies, they tear a part of their clothing. And there's a time that you have to grieve. It's okay to grieve. I was speaking to somebody this week who was saying, I just can't stop crying. They'd lost a loved one. And I said, that's okay. That's all right. It's, it's not crazy, it's not like people need to say to you, pull yourself together. There's a time to grieve, and that'll be different for each one of us. And all of us, I think, have been affected in the last while by this COVID pandemic, where we've lost good friends and even loved ones. But when we experience the loss and the heartache, we are still actually faced with a choice. We can still choose, firstly, to either let those emotions run their course, cry when you need to cry, talk about the person who's gone, feel that aina, and then move on. Or we can, I remember Cheryl, when she lost her husband, just a couple of weeks before I lost my wife. Cheryl shared with me that the Lord showed her that as she was feeling really down and dark and in a hole, the Lord said to her, you can stay in that hole as long as you want. Or when you're ready and you want help getting out, come, it's time to move on. Because I've come across people, I had an old aunt. She was actually my dad's aunt, so she was my great aunt, Auntie May. She was old when I was little. She had a boyfriend who was an aerial photographer in the Second World War. And his plane was shot down and he died. 1940 something, long time ago. She never married. She stayed in grief the rest of her life. She chose not to get over that loss in her life. And Auntie May was our old maiden great aunt. She was a teacher. She was grumpy with the kids. And but that was Auntie May. We loved her. There will come a time, and I can speak out of experience now, and I speak to people who have lost loved ones, where, and it's different for every person. Some people it might take weeks, some people it might take months, some might take a year or two, where we actually need to pick ourselves up, dust ourselves off, and say, you know what? I'm still here. What's next? If you're in that place of grief, remember, grief is allowed, but it's a season that needs to pass. You cannot stay in that forever. There needs to come a morning where you say, all right, what's next, Lord? I had to come to that place where I needed to say, all right, Lord, I'm still here. Kiki's with you. You know, I don't mind going now, but then the Lord said, I still got a hang of a lot for you to do while you're here. You have such a little time on earth. Finish your race. There's a time, and there's a time to move on. 5a and 6b says there's a time to scatter stones and a time to gather stones. A time to keep and a time to throw away. There's a time to build and there's a time to break down. There's a time to keep and there's a time to throw away. There's a time to keep friends and there's a time to throw them away. Not all friendships are meant to last a lifetime. Some are, but some people are in your life for a season and then need to go. And I believe every one of us, at least once a year, need to reevaluate our friendships and say, is this a win-win friendship or is this a win-lose? And I'm the one losing. Because that's not a friendship. If any of you have done biology, that's a parasitic relationship. It's not a symbiotic relationship. Symbiosis is when both organisms benefit. Have any of you ever seen lichen on a tree? And what's lichen in Afrikaans? That frilly grey stuff that you get on tree bark. Lichen. It's a combination of a fungus and an algae, if I remember correctly. And it's symbiotic. Both benefit. The one gets energy from photosynthesis, and the other eats off that and provides a matrix for them to live in. They both benefit. But then they're parasitic things. How many of you ever heard of botfly? And you get those flies that lay eggs on people, and they hatch out and the worms burrow under your skin and they grow, and it's, if you want to look at gross videos on YouTube. Go and look up botfly larva. Do you have any botfly friends? If God's called you to minister to somebody and you know you're going to be giving and they're going to be taking until they get healed, fine. But are there people in your life that they just use you? Maybe it's time to start turning that volume control down and saying, time to keep, time to throw away. Because if we're going to live a meaningful life as a mature person, we will not be able to make everybody happy all the time. We're going to have to say no to some people. And that's a sign of maturity. When my kids were little, they don't know how to say no. Come here, yes, go away, yes. I want to keep everybody happy. But I had 2 daughters. And when they got to teenagerhood, by then we had taught them, Louise, Katie, there are some things you need to say no to, especially if they are male and teenager. No. But how many of us have something that's got an official name? It's called a disease to please. That we just want to keep everybody happy. We're scared that if we don't say no and help them and do this and give them that, that they won't like us. Not everybody is meant to like us. It doesn't matter if they don't like you. Just be wise in what you do. Learn to say yes when it's right and learn to say no when it's right. It's okay to say no. It's okay to start distancing yourself from that person. It's okay not to invite them to the next braai. What happens if they're a family member? I don't know, am I the only one that's got family members who are botflies? Leeches? They just suck you dry. It's okay not to invite them. How will they ever learn if you don't say no? You know what? Saying no to somebody can actually help them. Because they won't ever change unless they experience no's. I always used to say when I taught years ago in a school in Witbank, I used to say, guys, you learn far more from losing than you ever do from winning. You have to deal with far more real issues when you lose. When you win, everybody just says, you're wonderful, you're wonderful. No, you're not all the time. Look at yourself in the mirror and say, I'm actually not perfect. In fact, when I look in the mirror, I have to put my glasses on so I can see properly. I know I'm not perfect. It says in the second half of 5 and the first half of 6, there's a time to embrace and a time to turn away, a time to search and a time to quit searching. Relationships. Do you know that there are waves in relationships? There are different times and seasons in relationships. I used to say to people when Kiki was around, I was a married man. I used to say, I don't always feel good about my wife. Sometimes she used to irritate the heaven out of me. I think I did that more to her than she did to me. I didn't always feel maanskin and rose and blomme and chocolates and everything like that. In fact, with my kids, I love my kids now, but sometimes they frustrate and irritate not just the heaven, the hell out of me. Sometimes you are going to feel, if you're in a love relationship, you're just going to feel bland, like pop, like after the second vaccine. That was my side effect after I had my second vaccine. I was just pop for a couple of days. You're going to feel like that. But when you do feel like that, please remember what it says there. It's a time to embrace and a time to turn away. Just because you're feeling pop and things aren't with your spouse or your children, that doesn't mean that your family is falling apart or that your marriage is in crisis and you need to find a new one. Relationships go through seasons. And it's okay to feel mildly irritated or really grumpy with somebody that is part of your family or a love relationship. It probably just means that if you're not feeling that lekker, that the wave has pulled back, and you've seen, if you haven't ever been to the sea, you've probably seen pictures of it. If you've been to the sea, when that wave pulls back, what's there? There's rocks, there's mushy green seaweed, and it doesn't look so fantastic until the next wave comes in and it's wonderful. You're going to have sharp rocks and mushy green seaweed kind of in between your toes every now and then in a love relationship, and that's okay, because there are seasons in that. And God says, cool, relax. Remember, our emotions, our feelings are horrible predictors and reflections of reality. Because think of it, you can look at a chocolate one day and it can just be, but the other times you look at a chocolate and it makes you want to throw up. Or do none of you, no, she doesn't have that problem. Never have you, broccoli? Or does that's the opposite. Some people can never look at broccoli and feel happy about it. You're going to have bad days. You're going to have tough times. But don't rely on your emotions. Because the emotions are influenced by hormones. They're influenced by how much sleep you've had. They're influenced by whether your team won or not. They are influenced by a whole bunch of other stuff, not true reality that's important. And so, pretty much like Colin's advice to me at the 60K mark on the Comrades Marathon, or that guy's advice to my brother when he gets to kilometer 6 of the Robben Island swim, if he, God willing, is able to do that in the new year. The good feelings will come back. Hang in there and just keep building on your relationship. Keep doing the right thing, no matter how you feel. It's okay to have dips. It's not a disaster. It's natural. Everybody else goes through those same kind of things. And lastly, just briefly, I want to finish off looking at verses 9 to 11. Read it with me. What do people really get for all their hard work? I've seen the burden God's placed on all of us. You will, and everybody else also feels at times. They feel frustrated. This is such a waste. I'm tired of having this thing around me all the time. Everybody feels like that. But it goes on to say there, yet God has made everything beautiful for its own time. He's planted eternity in the human heart. Even so, people can't see the whole scope of God's work from beginning to end. There are times when I feel frustrated with my life. When I get up and I'm feeling aina or the creaks and I'm not looking forward to what's going to happen to that day, whatever it happens to be. I try and remember that it says in there, verse 11, God has made everything beautiful for its own time. Every time I'm in, there's something beautiful that I can find in it. He's planted eternity in the human heart. Even so, people can't see the whole scope of God's work from beginning to end. I need to just say to myself, doesn't matter where I am, what season I'm in, whether it's lekker, whether it sucks, whether it's, when the wave is pulled back and it's sharp rocks and mushy, yucky, green goo, or whether that wave is there and it's all lekker, doesn't matter where. I don't understand. What did it say over there? We don't see the scope of God's work from beginning to end. We don't know what God has in store. He promises He's got something good in store. And every single time and season has a benefit for us. There is something that we will grow with in that season. There's something that will bless us in that season. And if I'm in that season, I was actually reading it in my quiet time this morning. It's in Proverbs chapter 15. I think it was verse 15. Yes. It says there, but all the days of the afflicted, of the people who are going through a hard time, all the days of the afflicted are bad. But a cheerful heart has a continual feast. I can choose to be a Chiefs supporter today, or a Sharks supporter today. Or I can choose to hopefully be an Australian supporter a bit later today. Or I can choose to have a cheerful heart. And if I choose to say, all right, this is a season, I'm in it, it sucks, but I'm going to get through it. I can choose a cheerful heart. I can have a continual feast. I can be in the middle of the hardest experience of my life, losing a loved one, and I can still stand up and smile and know that my life has purpose and meaning. God's placed eternity in our heart. We want more than just boring old, same old, same old. We want something more than just the daily grind of having to go to work and come home, or go to school and come home, or clean the house so that everybody makes it dirty again, so you can clean the house so that everybody can make it dirty again. And then you cook food so they eat it and don't even say thank you. And then you have to cook again because then they're hungry. Moms, when's the food coming? I'm hungry. And that's just your husband. God's timing is perfect. He's working something good in every situation, and no matter how hard it is, it too will pass. This verse, this passage in Ecclesiastes is all about choices. And we're in different seasons, and we have choices at different times. When is it the right time for me to say, all right, what's next? And stand up out of that grief. When is the right time to say, that friend is pulling me down, it's time to cut it off? When is the right time to get off the horse and say, that's not working, how we've done that in the past is not working? When do we make the change? Some changes are forced on us, we don't have any option. But most of these things are areas where we can choose when to do it. God says He knows the times and the seasons. And He says, it's in Isaiah, I think 30:41 or 30:41, I think it is. He says, you will hear a voice behind you, whispering, this is the way, walk in it. You need to listen to God. You need to stay close to Him. You need to actually say, all right, here's a decision coming up. This situation is hard. It probably needs to change. God will start prompting in your spirit. Then you need to say, all right, Lord, hear my ears. All both of these big wing nuts on the side of my head. Lord, speaks to I. I want to know when. Give me a sense of how. And He promises to do that. He'll give us the strength, because it takes guts to change. And He'll give us the guidance, the timing to do it just perfect. So listen. Listen to God's voice. Don't be surprised when the wheels fall off of your life, because they fall off of all of our lives, sometime or other. It's normal. You're not weird, strange, or unusual. You haven't sinned and the devil is clapping you because you stepped out of line and you didn't give your 5 cents in the collection, or you didn't give your 5 cents to that beggar or whatever. Good times and bad times happen. The waves come in, the waves go out. Listen to God. He'll lead you through this minefield. The bad times will pass. Amen. Let's pray. Father, thank you that you prepare us so well for life. Thank you that you tell us what's coming that we need to know about. And you show us how to cope and deal with every challenging situation. And if we're in a sharp rock and mushy green goo kind of a period in some part of our life, thank you for the encouragement you gave us this morning that will pass. The wave will come in again. And I pray that you'd help us to choose every day to make it a feast day. In spite of the stuff going on around us, help us to choose to just relax in you and know that, look, I don't know your plans, but you have something good in store. Show me today what I need to do. Show us today. Show us tomorrow as the technical week starts. What we need to change, where we need to break down, what we need to let go of, what we need to grab hold of. Thank you that you don't leave us alone, but you hold our hands and you say, come, let's walk this road together. Show us the next step, please, Lord, so that we can walk in the center of your will, shine for you and experience that abundant life that you promise. And we thank you in Jesus' name. Amen.